The stark, verdant hills of the Linfi Valley in Bridgend, Wales, frame a landscape defined by its industrial past and its close-knit present. In the autumn of 2010, the town of Maesteg and its surrounding villages were communities where neighbors knew one another's histories, and families had lived on the same terraced streets for generations. It was a place where safety was assumed, a quiet backdrop of grey skies and green forestry that felt removed from the violence of larger cities. Within this setting, the lives of two teenagers, Rebecca Aylward and Joshua Davies, intersected in the halls of Archbishop Magrath Catholic Comprehensive School. To the outside observer, their connection appeared to be nothing more than the typical, volatile melodrama of adolescence. Yet beneath the surface of teenage infatuation and social maneuvering, a disturbing reality was taking shape. Rebecca Aylward, known to her friends and family as Becca, was 15 years old. She was a bright, dedicated student, characterized by a gentle demeanor and a devout upbringing. Raised in a supportive, religious household by her mother Sonia, Becca was often described as the good girl of her peer group. She was soft-spoken, trusting, and harbored a romanticized view of the world that made her vulnerable to manipulation. Her life revolved around her studies, her close circle of friends, and her intense, unrequited affection for her former boyfriend. Becca was the type of teenager who saved text messages and analyzed every interaction for hidden meaning, believing in the possibility of reconciliation and redemption. She possessed an innocence that blinded her to the darker impulses of those she cared about, a trait that would ultimately be weaponized against her. Joshua Davies was also 15, a classmate of Rebecca's, and a figure of considerable influence within their social hierarchy. Outwardly, he was charming, intelligent, and popular, easily navigating the social currents of high school life. He was not a social outcast or a loner. Rather, he was a ringleader who enjoyed the attention and validation of his peers. Teachers and parents viewed him as a polite, articulate young man with a promising future. However, those closer to him witnessed a different side. Davies cultivated a reputation for being edgy and unpredictable, prone to making macabre jokes and testing the boundaries of acceptable behavior. He thrived on control, particularly in his interactions with Rebecca. While he had ended their romantic relationship, he refused to sever the tie completely, keeping her in his orbit through a cycle of mixed signals, harsh rejections, and sudden moments of feigned affection. The dynamic between the two was fundamentally asymmetrical. For Rebecca, Joshua was a first love, a subject of intense emotional investment. She bought new clothes to impress him and rearranged her schedule to accommodate his whims, convinced that his occasional kindnesses were proof of his lingering feelings. For Joshua, Rebecca was a pawn in a psychological game he played for the amusement of himself and his friends. The relationship had dissolved months prior, yet the digital footprint of their interaction grew denser. In the weeks leading up to October 2010, their communication was constant, primarily occurring through thousands of text messages and social media interactions. This digital dialogue would later serve as the primary window into the escalation of Davies's intent, revealing a mind that viewed violence as a form of social currency. The atmosphere surrounding their social group in late 2010 was steeped in the banal cruelty of teenage banter. But with Davies, the rhetoric turned unusually morbid. Among his circle of male friends, a recurring topic of conversation emerged: the murder of Rebecca Aylward. Initially dismissed by peers as dark humor or bravado, Davies began to speak openly about wanting her dead. He would detail various hypothetical methods of killing her, gauging the reactions of his friends. It was in this context that the now infamous wager was established. Davies claimed that if he successfully killed Rebecca, his friends would owe him a free cooked breakfast. What sounded to the teenage ear like an absurd, tasteless joke was, for Davies, a concrete challenge. The promise of a breakfast became a grim shorthand for the act. a trivial reward for a capital crime that underscored the complete lack of empathy driving his actions. As October deepened and the weather in the valley turned colder, the planning moved from abstract threats to logistical preparation. The location chosen for the proposed act was the forestry near Aberkenfig, a secluded area of woodland, popular with local youth for its privacy. It was a place where the density of the trees could hide both illicit teenage gatherings and, as Davies calculated, a violent crime. The setting was familiar to both of them, a neutral ground that would not raise Rebecca's suspicions. Davies knew that to lure her there, he had to exploit her hope. He played upon her desire for a reunion, suggesting that they meet in secret to talk, away from the prying eyes of their parents and friends. By the time the fateful weekend approached, the stage was fully set. The teenage social web, usually a source of support, had become a gallery of silent witnesses to Davies' escalating threats. Rebecca, unaware that she was the subject of a lethal bet, prepared for the meeting with a mixture of anxiety and excitement, believing she was finally getting the chance to win him back. Davies, conversely, was preparing to collect on his wager. The stark contrast between Rebecca's romantic expectations and Joshua's cold transactional intent defined the final days of their interaction. The woods waited, the texts were sent, and the trap was laid, driven by a chillingly trivial motivation that would shatter the quiet community of the Welsh valleys. To understand how a 15-year-old girl could be convinced to walk into a secluded forest with a boy who had publicly wished her dead, one must dissect the intricate and toxic architecture of the relationship between Rebecca Aylward and Joshua Davies. The bond they shared was not a simple case of teenage infatuation gone wrong, but a calculated exercise in psychological domination that had been escalating for months. While the physical act of the murder was brutal and immediate, the psychological homicide had been a slow, grinding process, facilitated by modern technology and the social dynamics of their peer group. The relationship had officially ended months prior to that October afternoon, but in the insular world of their Welsh town, the severance was never clean. Davies maintained a tether to Rebecca, a line he would pull whenever he felt his control waning. To the outside observer, and particularly to their circle of friends, Davies projected an image of utter disdain for his ex-girlfriend. He spoke of her with vitriol, utilizing a vocabulary of violence that eventually became the background noise of their social gatherings. He told friends he wanted her gone, that he hated her, and that he wished she were dead. This constant drumbeat of aggression desensitized those around him. His threats became a routine performance, a dark joke that nobody thought to stop because it seemed too absurd to be real. However, the Joshua Davies that Rebecca interacted with in the digital sphere was a markedly different character. While he was performing the role of the hate-filled ex-boyfriend to his peers, he was simultaneously keeping Rebecca engaged through a steady stream of mixed signals. He exploited her lingering affection and her teenage optimism that the relationship could be salvaged. Rebecca believed that underneath his abrasive exterior lay the boy she had cared for, and Davies weaponized this hope. He created a reality where she felt she was the only one who truly understood him, isolating her from the very friends who might have warned her about the specific nature of his threats. The digital footprint left behind by Davies offered a chillingly high-resolution map of this duality. Investigators later combed through thousands of text messages that painted a picture of a mind obsessed not with love, but with power. To his friends, the text messages were performative and gruesome. He detailed various methods he might use to kill her: poison, drowning, pushing her into a river. These were not vague expressions of anger, but specific, logistical musings that he broadcasted to his audience. The now infamous breakfast bet emerged from these digital conversations. It began as a grim challenge among teenage boys, a dare that Davies took as a binding contract. The promise of a free breakfast was never the motive, but rather the currency of his reputation. It was the mechanism by which he proved his dominance and fearlessness to his group. By framing the murder as a transactional bet, he stripped Rebecca of her humanity, reducing her life to the value of a morning meal. In stark contrast, the messages Davies sent to Rebecca were designed to lower her defenses. He utilized a classic push-pull dynamic. He would ignore her, making her anxious and desperate for his attention, and then suddenly offer a breadcrumb of affection or the possibility of a meeting. This inconsistency is a hallmark of traumatic bonding. The victim becomes addicted to the rare moments of kindness, enduring the periods of coldness or abuse in the hope of returning to the good times. Davies knew exactly which levers to pull. When he proposed the meeting in the woods, he framed it as a clandestine adventure, a special moment just for them. He emphasized secrecy, instructing her not to tell anyone where she was going or who she was meeting. This demand for secrecy was the final, crucial component of his control. By swearing her to silence, he ensured that no external rationality could pierce the bubble he had created. If Rebecca had told her mother or a close friend that she was meeting Josh in the woods to talk about getting back together, someone might have pointed out the danger or the oddity of the request given his public behavior. Davies effectively blinded her to the risks by making the secrecy a condition of the reunion. He turned the isolation into a romantic gesture, a shared secret that bound them together against the world. The weeks leading up to the murder were characterized by a flurry of digital planning that Rebecca was entirely oblivious to. Davies was not merely fantasizing, he was rehearsing. He texted friends about buying a new pair of boots, specifically mentioning that they would be good for the act. He discussed alibis and timelines. The obsession he held was not with Rebecca as a person, but with the event of her death and his ability to orchestrate it. He was directing a play, and Rebecca was merely the prop necessary for the final act. The level of premeditation revealed in the text logs showed that this was not a crime of passion or a sudden snap of teenage temper. It was a project he worked on, refined, and eventually executed. For Rebecca, the narrative was entirely different. She viewed the secrecy and the texts as signs that Joshua was finally ready to drop the public act of hatred and return to her. She purchased new clothes for the meeting, a tangible sign of her anticipation and desire to impress him. Her actions were those of a girl preparing for a date, while his were those of a predator preparing a trap. The disconnect between their two realities was absolute, bridged only by the deceit Davies employed. He allowed her to believe in a romantic reconciliation because it was the only way to get her to the murder weapon. The role of the peer group cannot be overstated in these dynamics. Davies required an audience. The bet was meaningless. Without the friends to witness his follow-through, he was driven by a need to shock and impress them, to be the one who actually did what others only joked about. The texts he sent to them, claiming he was going to do it, were met with disbelief or dark humor, which Davies interpreted as a challenge. The lack of intervention from the friend group reinforced his behavior. In his mind, their failure to report him or stop him was a form of tacit permission. He controlled the narrative within his social circle, just as he controlled Rebecca's emotions. He was the ringleader, and the murder was the ultimate stunt to cement his status. As the date approached, Davies' manipulation became laser-focused. He needed to ensure she would be at the specific location at the specific time without witnesses. The texts sent 2 days prior, alluding to the breakfast bet without revealing its true nature to her, demonstrate his arrogance. He was mocking her to her face, using inside jokes that she didn't know she was the victim of. "Don't say anything, but you may just owe me a breakfast," he wrote, a cryptic message that Rebecca likely interpreted as flirtatious banter, unaware that he was referencing the price on her head. This specific text encapsulates the entire dynamic. Davies deriving pleasure from the duping's deceit, enjoying the knowledge that he held the power of life and death while she remained oblivious. On the day of the murder, the control was absolute. Rebecca left her home, telling her mother she was visiting a friend nearby, a lie Davies had coached her to tell. She left behind her safety net, walking out of her house and into the narrative Davies had written for her. She was guided not by force, but by the invisible strings of emotional manipulation that had been attached to her for months. Every step she took toward the woods of Aberconfig was a testament to the success of Davies' psychological campaign. He had successfully rewritten her reality, convincing her that the boy who wanted to kill her was actually the boy who loved her. The tragedy lies in the total asymmetry of the relationship. Rebecca was operating within the framework of a teenage romance, dealing with the confusing signals of a first love. Davies was operating within a framework of sociopathic calculation. There was no argument, no heat of the moment fight that spiraled out of control. The violence was the conclusion of a script he had drafted in text messages and verified with his peers. The woods were not a place of random occurrence, but the stage he had selected. When they finally met, and he led her deeper into the trees, he was not just a boy walking with a girl. He was the architect of a catastrophe, finally bringing his dark digital fantasy into the physical world. The obsession was fulfilled not by possession of her heart, but by the extinguishing of her life, proving to himself and his friends that his control was ultimate and absolute. This script was not hidden in a diary or whispered in a dark alley, but broadcast across the digital network of a teenage social circle. The investigation would eventually recover thousands of pages of text messages, a digital footprint that transformed the perception of Joshua Davies from a troubled adolescent into a cold-blooded strategist. The volume of communication was staggering, yet within the mundane chatter about school, video games, and gossip, a sinister narrative thread began to thicken in the months leading up to October 2010. The concept of killing Rebecca Aylward did not emerge as a sudden, impulsive directive. It evolved as a dark collaborative fiction among Davies and his friends. Initially, the messages appeared to be posturing, the kind of edgy, hyperbolic humor often found in the darker corners of adolescent male bonding. Davies would text his friends claiming he wanted to get rid of her or that he hated her, using violent imagery that his peers largely dismissed as fantasy. This dismissal was a critical component of the tragedy, because his friends viewed him as a liar and a fantasist, who often made up stories to seem interesting or tough. They did not intervene. Instead, they engaged with him, challenging his claims and unintentionally gamifying the concept of murder. The dynamic shifted from venting to planning through the mechanism of a wager. The breakfast bet became the focal point of the premeditation. It is a detail that stands out for its grotesque banality. In the weeks prior to the murder, Davies complained to a friend that he wanted Rebecca out of his life. The friend, likely believing he was calling Davies' bluff on another one of his tall tales, texted back a proposition. The terms were simple and devastatingly trivial. If Davies actually went through with it, the friend would buy him a free breakfast, specifically a full fry-up. This wager provided Davies with a tangible, albeit absurd, objective. It crystallized the murder from a vague desire into a transaction. The digital record shows Davies latching onto this incentive with alarming seriousness. He began to update his friends on his progress, treating the planning phase as a series of logistical hurdles he needed to clear to win the prize. The texts reveal him weighing different methods of execution, discussing them with the casual detachment of someone choosing a strategy in a video game. He explored the idea of poisoning her. Texts exchanged with friends show him asking about plants and toxic substances. He mentioned foxgloves and belladonna, researching their availability and lethality. He discussed the possibility of pushing her into a river or throwing her off a quarry ledge. These were not internal monologues but active conversations. When one method was deemed too difficult or too risky, he discarded it and moved to the next. The friends, maintaining their stance that this was all an elaborate role-playing game, continued to respond. They requested proof. They asked for details. They fueled a fire that they believed was merely virtual. As October progressed, the tone of the messages hardened. The theoretical discussions gave way to scheduling. Davies needed a time and a place where he could isolate Rebecca without witnesses. The woods of Aberkenfig became the designated location. It was a place familiar to local teenagers, secluded enough to offer privacy but close enough to be accessible. Davies began to structure the timeline of the murder around his social calendar and the availability of the promised reward. 2 days before the murder, the intent was solidified in a text message that would later become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Davies messaged the friend who had offered the wager. The text was short, confident, and chillingly prophetic. He wrote, "Don't say anything, but you may just owe me a breakfast." This message marked the point of no return. It was the moment Davies committed himself to the act to save face and claim his reward. The ambiguity was gone. He was no longer asking, "What if?" He was stating, "When?" The friend's response and the silence of others who were privy to these threats created a vacuum of accountability. In the digital world they inhabited, the murder was still just words on a screen, a dark joke that had gone on too long but surely wouldn't bleed into reality. While this conspiracy of texts was culminating in a death sentence, Rebecca Aylward was living in a completely different reality. She was unaware of the bet, unaware that her life had been valued at the cost of a plate of eggs and bacon. To her, the renewed attention from Joshua Davies was a sign of hope. She interpreted his invitations not as lures, but as olive branches. She believed they were on the verge of getting back together. She told her own friends that Josh seemed different, that he was being nice again. The cruelty of the build-up lies in this deception. Davies used her affection for him as the primary weapon. He knew she would agree to meet him. He knew she would trust him to lead her into the woods. He manipulated her emotions with the same precision he used to manipulate his friend's perceptions. He played the role of the repentant ex-boyfriend perfectly, sending messages that kept her on the hook, without revealing his true intentions. In the final 48 hours, the digital traffic peaked. Davies was coordinating the logistics of the date. He arranged to meet Rebecca on Saturday, October 23. He ensured she would come alone. Simultaneously, he was managing the audience for his performance. He texted his friends to let them know the plan was in motion. He wanted them to know that he was not a liar, that he was capable of the violence he had promised. The need for validation from his peers appeared to override any moral hesitation. The breakfast was the trophy, but the respect of his friend group was the true motivation. He wanted to shed the label of the fantasist and establish himself as someone to be feared and taken seriously. On the morning of the murder, the disconnect between the two teenagers was absolute. Rebecca prepared for the meeting with excitement. She dressed carefully, buying new clothes for the occasion, anxious to impress the boy she loved. She told her family she was going to see friends, shielding the meeting from parental scrutiny, a common behavior for a teenager rekindling a relationship parents might disapprove of. She was walking into a trap that had been constructed over weeks of text messages, built on a foundation of a macabre wager. Davies, conversely, was preparing for an execution. The texts from that morning and the days prior suggest a mind entirely focused on the mechanics of the act and the alibi. He had scouted the location. He had selected the weapon, not a poison or a cliff, but the brute force of a heavy rock found at the scene. The shift from the complex methods discussed in the text's poison, drowning to the crude reality of blunt force trauma, suggests a pragmatism that settled in as the time approached. The digital plans were elaborate, but the physical act would be simple and violent. The friends who were part of the breakfast bet thread remained on the periphery. They did not alert the police. They did not warn Rebecca or her family. They waited to see if Davies would actually deliver. The screen provided a barrier of dissociation. As long as the murder was contained within the text bubbles on their phones, it wasn't real. It was content. It was drama. It was a game. As the afternoon of October 23 approached, the digital silence from Davies signaled the transition from planning to action. He met Rebecca, as arranged. The text stopped, and the physical timeline began. The script he had drafted was now being acted out in real time, under the canopy of the Aberconfig woods. The boy who had spent weeks typing out threats was now standing before the girl who believed he was there to reconcile. The breakfast bet, a joke born in the boredom of teenage texting, had set a clock ticking that could no longer be stopped. The planning was over. The performance was about to begin. Saturday, the 23rd of October 2010, dawned with the grey, pervasive dampness typical of autumn in South Wales. In the Aylward household, the atmosphere was contrary to the weather. It was bright with anticipation. Rebecca Aylward, 15 years old and deeply intelligent, spent the morning preparing for what she believed was a pivotal moment in her young life. She had risen early, meticulously styling her hair and selecting her outfit with the gravity only a teenager in love can assign to clothing. She chose a new jacket, one she had purchased specifically for this occasion, believing it would signal a fresh start. To her mother, Sonia, she offered a partial truth, stating she was going to visit friends in nearby Bridgend. The reality was a secret she guarded with a mixture of anxiety and thrill. She was meeting Joshua Davies. The digital lure had been cast days prior, and the hook was set deep. Davies had played the role of the repentant ex-boyfriend to perfection, utilizing text messages and social media to dismantle Rebecca's defenses. He had suggested they meet to talk, to perhaps rekindle the relationship that Rebecca had never truly let go of. For weeks, he had oscillated between cruelty and charm, keeping her off balance. But as the date approached, his tone had shifted to one of invitation. He suggested a walk. He suggested they spend time alone. Rebecca, interpreting this as a romantic overture, was eager to comply. She viewed this Saturday not as a trap, but as a second chance. Sonia Aylward drove her daughter to Sarn Hill, the designated drop-off point. The car ride was routine, filled with the mundane chatter of a mother and daughter. When the car pulled over near the agreed location, Rebecca stepped out into the chill air. She looked happy. She waved goodbye to her mother, a gesture that would sear itself into Sonia's memory, and turned to walk toward the meeting place. It was shortly after 12:30 p.m. The separation between the safety of her home life and the danger waiting in the woods was now complete. Joshua Davies was already waiting. He stood near the predetermined spot, his demeanor betraying none of the violence that had been brewing in his digital correspondence. To any observer, they appeared to be merely two teenagers meeting up on a weekend afternoon. There were no shouts, no arguments, and no signs of coercion. This was the most insidious element of the lure. Rebecca went willingly. She walked toward him not with fear, but with the hope that the boy she loved had finally returned to her. They began to walk together through Aberconfig, heading away from the populated streets and toward the fringes of the village. Witnesses who saw them later reported nothing amiss. They were just a boy and a girl walking side by side. However, the dynamic was fundamentally predatory. Davies was leading her. He steered their path toward the river Ogmore, moving steadily toward the dense tree line of Goiter Wood. The location was not accidental. It was a place known to local youths, a spot of seclusion where the noise of the town was swallowed by the density of the trees and the rush of the river. Davies had selected it for its privacy. As they entered the woods, the terrain grew rougher, the ground soft with mud and fallen leaves. The canopy overhead filtered the meager daylight, casting the forest floor in shadow. The air here was colder, smelling of wet earth and decay. Rebecca, trusting Davies implicitly, followed him deeper into the thicket. They walked for some time, moving past the casual paths used by dog walkers and into the more obscured areas of the woodland. The conversation during this walk remains known only to Davies, but the text records suggest he maintained the facade until the very end. He had to keep her calm. He had to keep her close. The destination was a clearing, secluded and shielded from view by thick vegetation. It was here that the pretense evaporated. The transition from a romantic reconciliation to a brutal execution was instantaneous. There was no argument that escalated out of control, no heat of passion that blinded reason. This was the cold calculation of the weeks prior manifesting in physical action. Davies instructed Rebecca to look away, or engaged her in a way that exposed her vulnerability. He had prepared for this moment. He located a rock, a heavy, jagged stone from the forest floor. It was a weapon of opportunity, yet its use was entirely premeditated. When Davies struck, the violence was absolute. He brought the rock down on Rebecca's head with significant force. The betrayal was as physical as it was emotional. The person Rebecca had dressed up for, the person she had defended to her concerned family, became her killer in a fraction of a second. The attack did not stop with a single blow. The forensic evidence would later indicate a sustained assault, ensuring that the job was finished. The promise of a free breakfast, a macabre joke that had circulated through the digital ether of his friend group, was being fulfilled in the mud of Goiter Wood. Silence returned to the clearing quickly. Rebecca lay still on the damp ground, her new jacket stained, her future extinguished. Davies stood over her. In this moment, the dissociation that had characterized the text messages might have been expected to shatter, replaced by the horror of reality. Instead, Davies remained chillingly pragmatic. He did not call for an ambulance. He did not scream for help. He checked to ensure she was dead. The reality of the corpse at his feet did not induce panic. It induced a need for verification. He reached for his phone. The device, which had been the instrument of the lure, now became the instrument of the broadcast. He needed to confirm the act to the audience he had been performing for. He navigated to the message thread that contained the breakfast bet. His fingers moved over the keypad, composing a message that bridged the gap between his dark fantasy and the grim reality. He texted a friend, the words stark and undeniable. "I've done it." The reception of this message on the other end was met with skepticism. The friends, safe in their bedrooms and living rooms, assumed this was another layer of the game, another attempt by Davies to gain attention or status within the group. They texted back, demanding proof. They could not conceive that the banter about murder had actually materialized into a body in the woods. Davies, standing just feet away from Rebecca's remains, grew frustrated by their disbelief. He was not playing a role anymore. He was a killer, and he wanted the credit he felt he was owed. He spent time in the woods after the killing, not in mourning, but in management. He attempted to obscure the body, covering Rebecca with leaves and debris, a primitive attempt to buy time. It was not a sophisticated burial, it was a hasty concealment designed to delay discovery just long enough for him to construct his next moves. The woods, which had been a place of adventure and teenage exploration, were now a crime scene. The rushing river nearby, which had provided a scenic backdrop for their walk, now served only to drown out any lingering sounds of the struggle. Davies eventually turned to leave. He walked out of Goiter Wood alone. The path back to civilization was the same one he had taken with Rebecca less than an hour earlier, but the context had irrevocably changed. He emerged from the tree line and re-entered the world of the living, composing himself to mask the violence he had just committed. He did not run. He did not flee the county. He walked back into town to continue his Saturday. His behavior in the hours immediately following the murder was a study in sociopathic compartmentalization. He met up with friends, the very same circle aware of the bet. When he saw them, his demeanor was eerily normal. He was not covered in blood. He had likely taken care to clean himself or avoid the spray during the attack. He appeared calm, perhaps even energized by the adrenaline of the act. When the friends asked about Rebecca, assuming he had merely stood her up or had an argument, Davies was direct. He told them again that he had killed her. He offered to show them the body. This offer to return to the scene was not a confession of guilt born of remorse. It was a trophy presentation. Davies wanted witnesses to his capability. He wanted to prove that he was not just a talker, but a doer. The friends, still caught in the buffer of disbelief, struggled to process his words. To them, the breakfast bet was law, a dark joke that bound their group together. The idea that Davies had actually bludgeoned Rebecca to death was too large a concept to fit into their understanding of their friend. They assumed he was lying, that he was taking the joke too far. As the afternoon wore on, the silence from Rebecca's phone began to raise alarms elsewhere. Sonia Aylward, expecting her daughter to return or at least check in, felt the first twinges of maternal instinct turning to dread. Calls went straight to voicemail. Texts remained unanswered. The bright anticipation of the morning began to curdle into panic. Sonia began reaching out to Rebecca's friends, trying to trace her movements. She eventually contacted Davies. Davies answered his phone. His voice was steady, his tone helpful. When Sonia asked if he had seen Rebecca, he lied with the fluidity of someone who had rehearsed the script. He claimed she had never showed up. He said he had waited for her, but she had stood him up. He expressed feigned concern, suggesting that maybe she had gone off with someone else or had lost track of time. He played the part of the jilted but worried ex-boyfriend, using the very emotional leverage he had exploited to lure her to the woods to now deflect suspicion from himself. While Sonia frantically searched, driving through the streets of Bridgend and Abercon Fig, Davies continued his social interactions. He watched television. He texted. He lived the typical Saturday of a 15-year-old boy, all while Rebecca lay cooling in the undergrowth of Goiter Wood. The gap between the normal world and the atrocity in the forest was maintained solely by Davies's ability to lie. He was the gatekeeper of the truth, and he held it tight, releasing only what was necessary to maintain his cover. Later that afternoon, the reality of the situation began to bleed through the group of friends. Davies was persistent. He insisted they come to the woods. Eventually, curiosity or a growing, gnawing fear drove a few of them to agree. They followed him back to the tree line. The walk back to the scene was surreal for the group. Davies led the way, retracing his steps with confidence. When they reached the clearing, he pointed. The friends looked. The barrier of dissociation finally shattered. They saw Rebecca. The shock was absolute. This was no longer a text message thread. It was not a game. The stillness of her body, the violence of the scene, and the undeniable reality of death crashed down upon them. Davies stood by, observing their reactions. He had won the bet. In his warped perspective, he had delivered on his promise. The reaction of the friends was a mix of horror and paralysis. They did not immediately rush to the police station. They did not run to Sonia Aylward. The psychological hold Davies held, combined with the sheer trauma of what they were seeing, kept them in a state of inaction. They left the woods, carrying the weight of the secret with them. Davies had made them accomplices to the knowledge, if not the act. He had pulled them out of the digital periphery and into the physical reality of his crime, binding them with silence. Night fell over Abercon Fig. The rain continued to drizzle, washing away trace evidence, soaking into the forest floor. Rebecca Aylward remained in the woods, alone in the dark. In her home, the panic had reached a fever pitch, with police being notified of a missing person. Officers began the standard protocols, asking questions, checking hospitals, and pinging cell towers. They were looking for a runaway or a girl who had stayed out too late. They were not yet looking for a murder victim. Joshua Davies went home. He ate dinner. He interacted with his family. He went to sleep in his own bed, his phone on the nightstand, the device now holding the timeline of a murder in its memory chips. The text messages, the planning, the breakfast bet. It was all there. Digital fingerprints that he arrogantly believed would never be reconstructed to condemn him. He had killed Rebecca Aylward because he could, because he said he would, and because the line between virtual posturing and physical violence had been erased in his mind. The sun had set on October 23, hiding the crime in the shadows of Goiter Wood, but the digital trail was indelible, waiting for the light of investigation to reveal the cold mechanics of a teenager's calculated cruelty. Sunday morning broke over Bridgend with a persistent, chilling drizzle, typical of a Welsh October. For the Aylward family, the grey sky mirrored the dread that had settled in their stomachs overnight. Rebecca had not come home. Her bed was empty, the sheets undisturbed. Her mobile phone, usually an extension of her hand, went straight to voicemail. The silence from the device was deafening. While the police were initially treating this as a potential teenage runaway case, the family instinctively knew the behavior was out of character. Rebecca was reliable, communicative, and deeply attached to her family. She did not vanish without a word. At the center of the timeline was Joshua Davies. He was the last known person to see her alive. On that Sunday morning, while Rebecca's mother, Sonia, was frantic with worry, Davies appeared calm. When Sonia reached out to him, desperate for any crumb of information, he played the role of the concerned ex-boyfriend with chilling proficiency. He admitted that they had met the previous afternoon. He told Sonia, and subsequently the police, that they had gone for a walk, chatted amicably, and then parted ways. His narrative was specific and calculated to deflect suspicion. He claimed that Rebecca had left him to meet another boy, someone she had been talking to, perhaps someone she met online. He painted a picture of a girl moving on, leaving him behind to pursue a new interest. To bolster this fabrication, Davies engaged in a theater of digital concern. He updated his Facebook status, expressing worry about Rebecca's whereabouts. He sent text messages to her dead phone, knowing full well she would never read them. "Where are you?" he typed. "Everyone is worried." These messages were not impulsive. They were a digital alibi, breadcrumbs scattered to lead investigators toward the conclusion that he was just a bystander, a worried friend waiting for her to return. He sat in his family's living room, watching the rain, maintaining a facade of absolute normalcy, while the search parties began to mobilize. However, the reality of that Sunday was far darker than mere deception. Davies was not just hiding a crime, he was boasting about it. The breakfast bet, the promise of a free meal, if he killed Rebecca, required proof. In the twisted social currency of his peer group, words were not enough. He needed to show them. That same morning, while the Aylward family was printing missing person flyers, Davies contacted two of his friends. He told them he had done it. He told them Rebecca was dead. When they expressed disbelief, he offered to take them to her. In a move that defies comprehension, Davies led the two boys into the woods near Aberkenfig. He walked them along the muddy trails, past the dense undergrowth, retracing the steps he had taken with Rebecca less than 24 hours earlier. When they reached the clearing, he pointed. There, amidst the wet leaves and the damp earth, lay Rebecca's body. She was face down. The violence of the act was immediately apparent to the boys. Davies did not show remorse. He did not panic. He reportedly stood over the victim he had bludgeoned and treated the scene as the fulfillment of a wager. He asked his friends if they believed him now. The boys, stunned and terrified, stared at the remains of their peer. They left the woods with Davies, carrying the burden of a horrific secret. For the rest of Sunday, the investigation remained a missing person inquiry, but the ground was shifting. The police were conducting interviews, and Davies was brought in for questioning as a witness. He stuck to his script. He was polite, cooperative, and consistent. He described their meeting in detail, inventing conversations and movements. He reiterated the story of the mystery boy Rebecca was meeting. The investigators, trained to detect deception, found his demeanor unnervingly steady. He did not fidget. He did not stumble. He looked them in the eye and lied with the confidence of someone who believed he was smarter than the adults in the room. The breakthrough did not come from police deduction, but from the fracturing of the teenage code of silence. The burden of what they had seen in the woods was too heavy for the friends to carry. By Monday morning, the secret unraveled. One of the boys who had been taken to the crime scene confessed to his parents. He told them that Joshua had killed Rebecca and that he had seen her body in the woods. The parents, horrified, immediately contacted the police. The tone of the investigation instantly transformed from a rescue mission to a recovery operation. The information provided by the friend was specific. He guided the police not to a general area, but to a specific location in the forest of Ford Lounsbury. Officers, now treating the site as a crime scene, moved in with caution. The weather remained bleak, the rain turning the forest floor into a sludge that complicated the approach. Deep within the woodland, shielded by the canopy and the isolation of the area, they found her. Rebecca Aylward lay where Davies had left her. The brutality of the attack was visceral. She had been struck repeatedly with a heavy rock, a weapon of opportunity that had been wielded with extreme force. The rock was found nearby, a silent testament to the violence of her final moments. The scene was secured, the white tents of the forensics team rising against the green and brown of the forest, marking the transition from hope to grief. With the discovery of the body, Joshua Davies was arrested on suspicion of murder. The transition from witness to suspect did not break his composure. In the interrogation room, faced with the reality that the body had been found, Davies pivoted. He did not confess. Instead, he adapted his lies. He spun a new narrative, one that attempted to leverage the very friends he had involved. He claimed that he and one of the friends had gone to the woods with Rebecca, and that it was the friend who had attacked her. He positioned himself as the frightened witness, the one who had tried to stop it, the one who was too scared to come forward. It was a calculated attempt to sow doubt, to pit his word against another's, hoping the lack of a third-party witness would create enough ambiguity to save him. The investigators, however, had seized the mobile phones of everyone involved. The digital forensics lab began the arduous task of extracting data-deleted messages, call logs, and timestamps. What they found? Dismantled Davies' defense piece by piece. The history of the crime was written in SMS. Thousands of texts were recovered, painting a picture of a long, slow premeditation. The officers read through weeks of messages between Davies and his friends. They found the discussions about the method: poisoning, drowning, pushing her into the river. They found the messages where Davies expressed his desire to get rid of her. And then they found the texts regarding the bet. The frivolity of the motive was jarring against the grim photos from the crime scene. Friends had texted him, promising a cooked breakfast if he actually went through with it. Crucially, the timeline of the texts contradicted Davies' new story of being a bystander. 2 days before the murder, he had texted a friend, "Don't say anything, but you may just owe me a breakfast." This was not the panic of a boy watching a friend snap. It was the cold calculation of an executioner planning his date. On the day of the murder, shortly before meeting Rebecca, he texted, "The time has come." As the police built their case, the contrast between the brutal reality of the physical evidence and Davies' feigned innocence became the focal point. He continued to deny responsibility, maintaining his innocence with a steadfastness that bordered on delusion. He seemed unable to grasp that the digital footprint he had created was indelible. He had deleted messages from his own phone, believing them gone forever, unaware that they lived on in the server logs and the handsets of his recipients. The post-mortem examination of Rebecca confirmed the savage nature of the assault. She had suffered severe head injuries, consistent with blunt force trauma. The pathologist's report indicated that the attack had been sustained and focused. This was not an accident, nor a singular blow of frustration. It was an intent to kill. The rock used was significant in size, requiring effort to lift and swing. The physical evidence corroborated the narrative emerging from the text messages. This was a focused effort to end a life. The community of Aberconfig was left reeling. The woods, a place of childhood play and teenage hangouts, were now marked by police tape and flowers. The betrayal was absolute. Rebecca had trusted Joshua. She had agreed to meet him, hoping for reconciliation, or perhaps just closure, lured by the familiarity of a boy she had once loved. Instead, she walked into a trap set by someone who viewed her life as less valuable than a free breakfast. As the investigation moved toward the prosecution phase, Davies' behavior remained a study in detachment. During interviews, when presented with the text messages, he offered no comment or dismissed them as jokes. He relied on the ambiguity of text communication, claiming that the threats were sarcasm, that the breakfast talk was just banter. He tried to sanitize the macabre discussions, stripping them of their lethal intent. But the body in the woods and the precision of the timing belied any claim of humor. The police also focused on the friends. The investigation revealed a disturbing group dynamic, a circle where Davies' toxic assertions were met not with intervention, but with egging on. While they had not struck the blow, their failure to report the threats and the bet itself provided the social framework that Davies used to validate his actions. However, the legal focus remained tight on Davies. He was the one who lured her. He was the one who picked up the rock. The discovery phase concluded with a mountain of evidence. The forensic biology matched Davies to the scene. The rock carried traces that linked it to the act. The timeline established by cell tower pings placed him in the woods at the exact time of death, destroying his alibi of her leaving to meet someone else. The boy from Bridgend was a ghost, a fiction created to buy time. Ultimately, the investigation peeled back the layers of a teenage sociopath. It exposed a boy who could bludgeon a girl to death, go home, eat dinner, and text her mother with fake concern. The discovery and investigation was not just about finding a body. It was about uncovering the hollowness of a killer who thought he could delete a murder as easily as a text message. The case was ready for trial, resting on the chilling convergence of physical brutality and digital proof of a murder planned for weeks, all for a wager that was never paid. The investigation peeled back the layer of teenage secrecy to reveal a digital archive that transformed the case from a spur-of-the-moment tragedy into a cold, calculated execution. Detectives seized mobile phones, laptops, and computer towers from Joshua Davies' home and the residences of his close social circle. In 2010, the primary mode of communication for teenagers in Bridgend was text messaging and Facebook, creating a dense, time-stamped record of thoughts, intentions, and conversations. When forensic data analysts began the arduous process of extracting and cataloging these exchanges, they uncovered thousands of pages of dialogue that painted a disturbing portrait of obsession and violence. The sheer volume of data was overwhelming, but specific keywords and timelines allowed investigators to isolate relevant threads. The narrative that emerged from the digital void was not one of a heartbroken boy or an accidental death, but of a weeks-long conspiracy to commit murder. The most damning piece of evidence centered on a macabre wager that had become an open secret among Davies' friends. Buried within the logs was a conversation between Davies and a friend, where the friend promised to buy Davies a cooked breakfast if he actually went through with killing Rebecca. While the defense would later attempt to characterize this as dark, meaningless banter typical of teenage boys, the prosecution pointed to the methodical way Davies sought to collect on the debt. 2 days before the murder, the digital trail showed a chilling message sent from Davies' phone to the friend who had proposed the bet. It read, "Don't say anything, but you may just owe me a breakfast." This single sentence dismantled any notion of spontaneity. It proved that when Davies woke up on that Saturday morning, the intent to kill was already fixed in his mind. The text was not a joke. It was a statement of intent, a confirmation that the planning phase was over and the operational phase had begun. Further analysis of the text history revealed that the concept of killing Rebecca had been a recurring theme for months. The logs showed Davies researching and discussing various methods of disposal and execution. In one exchange, he asked friends for advice on how to snap someone's neck. In another, he discussed the possibility of poisoning her with foxglove or drowning her in a river. He even mused about pushing her into a quarry. These were not fleeting thoughts, but sustained, detailed discussions that evolved over time. The digital forensics showed a pattern of escalation. What began as vague expressions of hatred for his ex-girlfriend crystallized into specific scenarios. He texted about wanting to get rid of her and described the act of killing as a necessity to remove her from his life. The texts also exposed a series of failed attempts, or dry runs, that predated the actual murder. One conversation detailed a plan to meet Rebecca in the woods weeks earlier, a plan that was aborted when Davies claimed he didn't have the bottle to go through with it that day. Another thread involved a discussion about poisoning her drink, which he claimed to have tried but failed, because she complained the drink tasted strange. These records provided a terrifying context to the final event in Aberkenn Fig. Rebecca had unknowingly walked into a trap that had been set and reset multiple times before the final, fatal encounter. The forensic examination of the phones also destroyed Davies' initial alibi and his subsequent attempts to shift blame. In the hours immediately following the murder, Davies engaged in a calculated performance of innocence via text message. He messaged Rebecca's phone, asking where she was and why she hadn't turned up to meet him, creating a false digital trail to suggest she was still alive and missing. He texted her mother, expressing concern and offering to help look for her. However, cross-referencing these texts with the cell tower triangulation proved that during the time he claimed to be waiting for her, he was deep in the woods, at the exact coordinates where her body was found. The boy from Bridgend, the fictional third party Davies invented to explain the presence of another male, was proven to be non-existent. There were no calls, texts, or signals linking Rebecca or Davies to any unknown number during the critical window. The only two phones active in that sector of the woods belonged to the victim and the perpetrator. Simultaneous to the digital decoding, the physical forensics team focused on the weapon and the biological evidence recovered from the scene. The murder weapon was identified as a large, jagged rock found near the body. It was a heavy piece of slate, consistent with the geological debris found on the forest floor. But its placement and condition drew immediate attention. It required significant force to lift and wield. Forensic biology confirmed the presence of Rebecca's blood and tissue on the rock, linking it definitively to the trauma on her skull. The weather on the day of the murder had been wet, and the rain had degraded some surface evidence, but the impact points remained. Crucially, the forensic examination of Davies' clothing provided the physical link to the violence. Despite the rain and the time elapsed before his arrest, trace evidence remained. Fibers found on his clothing matched the fibers from Rebecca's jacket. More damning was the absence of any defensive wounds on Davies that would suggest a struggle with a third party. If, as he later claimed during interrogations, he had tried to defend her from an attacker, forensic pathologists would expect to see corresponding marks on his hands or arms. There were none. The only violence recorded on his person was the invisible weight of the crime, while the physical evidence on the victim showed she had been struck from behind or while incapacitated, giving her no chance to fight back. The autopsy report, when read in conjunction with the text messages, painted a brutal picture of the final moments. The injuries were severe and catastrophic, caused by multiple blows. This contradicted any theory of an accidental fall or a single, reflexive strike. The sheer brutality required to inflict such damage spoke to a level of rage and determination that aligned perfectly with the vitriol found in the text archives. The forensic pathologist determined that the assailant had continued to strike even after the victim was rendered defenseless. This was not a panic-induced reaction. It was a focused effort to ensure death, fulfilling the criteria of the bet that had been discussed so casually in the weeks prior. As investigators delved deeper into the social media aspect, they found that Davies' online behavior after the murder was psychopathic in its normalcy. While a community search was organized and Rebecca's family was frantic with worry, Davies was updating his status and chatting with friends about mundane topics. He even sent a text to the friend involved in the bet shortly after the murder, simply stating, "I did it." This admission, brief and chilling, was corroborated by the recipient, who initially thought Davies was joking until the reality of the discovery set in. The friend's subsequent interrogation revealed that Davies had shown him the body to prove he had won the wager. This witness testimony, backed by the timestamps of the texts, created an unassailable timeline. The synthesis of the digital and physical evidence eliminated all other possibilities. The bet provided the motive, however trivial and horrific. The text logs provided the premeditation, proving malice aforethought. The cell tower data provided the opportunity, placing him at the scene. The rock and biological traces provided the method. The investigation demonstrated that Davies had not only planned the murder, but had treated it as a social currency, a way to gain status within his peer group. He had turned the life of a human being into a transaction for a free breakfast. Detectives also uncovered a disturbing lack of intervention from the peer group. The text archives showed that several friends were aware of Davies' threats. While some dismissed them as posturing, others engaged with the fantasy, offering suggestions or laughing along. The breakfast bet was known to a small circle, yet no one alerted Rebecca or her family. The digital silence from the bystanders was as loud as the incriminating texts from the perpetrator. This collective failure was documented in the megabytes of data extracted from the seized devices, showing a teenage ecosystem where violence was normalized through screens and keypads until it bled into reality. By the time the Crown Prosecution Service received the full brief, the case was no longer relying on a confession or eyewitness accounts alone. It was built on a foundation of indisputable data. The text messages were transcribed into a script of the murder, line by line, from the initial idea to the final execution. The forensic biology anchored that script to the physical world. The defense's narrative of a boy caught in a bad situation was obliterated by the boy's own words, saved on servers and SIM cards, testifying against him from the past. The evidence did not just point to Joshua Davies. It revealed the cold, hollow mechanism of his thinking, proving that Rebecca Aylward's death was the result of a long, quiet, and digital conspiracy. The trial of Joshua Davies convened at Swansea Crown Court in June 2011, 8 months after Rebecca Aylward's body was recovered from the damp leaf litter of the Bridgend Woods. The courtroom was packed, reflecting the community's horror at a crime that seemed to violate the fundamental innocence of childhood. Davies, appearing in the dock wearing a suit that seemed too large for his slight teenage frame, entered a plea of not guilty. Despite the mountain of digital evidence and the specific nature of the location where Rebecca was found, he maintained that he was not the one who had wielded the rock. Greg Taylor, QC, leading the prosecution, opened the case by characterizing the murder not as a crime of sudden passion, but as the grim conclusion to a prolonged period of testing boundaries. The Crown's strategy hinged on proving that the breakfast bet was not merely dark adolescent humor, but a contractual agreement that Davies intended to honor. Taylor presented the jury with a narrative of a young man obsessed with his own reputation for ruthlessness, someone who sought validation from his peers through escalating threats. The prosecutor argued that Davies had lured Rebecca to the woods with the express intention of killing her to win the wager, a free cooked breakfast from a friend. The digital footprint, which had been so meticulously reconstructed by investigators, became the prosecution's most damning witness. The courtroom screens displayed the text messages in chronological order, allowing the jury to read the evolution of the murder plot in Davies' own words. The message, "Don't say anything, but you may just owe me a breakfast," was projected for the court to see, serving as the pivot point where fantasy crossed into reality. The prosecution called the friends involved in the bet to the stand. These teenagers, whose names were protected due to their age, testified that they had indeed promised Davies a breakfast if he killed Rebecca, though they universally claimed they believed he was joking. Their testimony painted a picture of a toxic social circle where Davies cultivated a persona of violence and where his peers, desensitized by the constant stream of macabre texts, failed to intervene. When the defense presented its case, the strategy was one of deflection and confusion. Davies took the stand, a risky move that exposed him to cross-examination. His defense counsel attempted to portray him as a frightened boy caught in a situation he could not control, but Davies' own testimony contradicted the physical evidence. He admitted to being in the woods with Rebecca, but claimed that he did not kill her. Instead, he introduced a new narrative, blaming one of the friends he had texted before the murder. Davies told the jury that while he and Rebecca were walking, this friend had appeared and attacked her. According to Davies, he had attempted to stop the assault, but was overpowered or too scared to intervene. This defense crumbled under scrutiny. The prosecution dismantled Davies' version of events by highlighting the logistical impossibilities and the lack of forensic evidence linking the accused friend to the scene. The friend he implicated had a solid alibi, corroborated by witnesses and digital location data. Furthermore, Davies could not explain why, if he were innocent and traumatized by witnessing a murder, he had spent the evening after Rebecca's death joking with friends, watching television, and calmly updating his Facebook status. His demeanor in the witness box, detached, arrogant, and occasionally smirking, did little to endear him to the jury. He displayed a chilling lack of emotion when photographs of the crime scene and his former girlfriend's injuries were shown. The cross-examination revealed Davies to be a manipulator who tailored his lies to fit the available evidence. When confronted with the sheer volume of texts expressing his desire to kill Rebecca, he dismissed them as banter. When asked about the rock, he claimed ignorance. The disconnect between his claims of innocence and the overwhelming proof of his premeditation, the purchase of new clothes, the deletion of messages, the specific luring of the victim to a secluded spot, left the defense with little room to maneuver. After 5 weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury retired to consider their verdict. The deliberation was tense, spanning several days. On the 27th of July 2011, they returned to the courtroom. By a majority verdict of 10-2, the jury found Joshua Davies guilty of murder. As the foreman read the word guilty, a gasp rippled through the public gallery. Rebecca's mother, Sonia Aylward, who had sat through every harrowing detail of her daughter's final moments, wept openly. Davies, conversely, remained impassive, staring straight ahead as the reality of his future was sealed. Sentencing was deferred to September to allow for psychiatric reports, though the mandatory sentence for murder was life imprisonment. When the court reconvened, Justice Lloyd Jones did not mince words. He addressed Davies directly, describing the murder as devious, calculating, and cold-blooded. The judge noted that Davies had shown absolutely no remorse throughout the process, maintaining his lie even after the verdict. The breakfast bet was highlighted as a particularly disturbing aspect of the case, illustrating a deep moral vacuum. Justice Lloyd Jones sentenced Joshua Davies to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, the juvenile equivalent of a life sentence. He set a minimum tariff of 14 years before Davies could even be considered for parole. This meant Davies would remain in prison until at least 2025, and only then would a parole board assess if he was safe to release. The judge emphasized that the 14-year term was a minimum, not a fixed sentence, and that Davies might never be released if he continued to pose a danger to the public. In his closing remarks, the judge condemned the defendant's actions not just for the loss of Rebecca's life, but for the profound betrayal of trust. He spoke of how Davies had exploited Rebecca's lingering affection for him to draw her into the trap. The sentence reflected the severity of the betrayal and the premeditated nature of the violence. As Davies was led away to the cells to begin his sentence, the legal chapter closed. But the questions regarding the social dynamics that allowed a murder to be planned via text message remained. The outcome was a legal victory for the Crown, yet it offered only a sterile form of closure for a family whose daughter had been traded for a breakfast. Following the sentencing, the finality of the court's decision offered little respite for Rebecca Aylward's family. While Joshua Davies was removed from society, the knowledge that others had been aware of his intentions remained a source of profound torment for Rebecca's mother, Sonia. The revelation that the murder had been framed as a wager for a breakfast initiated a difficult legal and emotional crusade to address the culpability of the bystanders. Sonia argued that the failure of Davies's friends to report his threats constituted a fatal lapse in moral and civic duty, prompting a broader public debate regarding the legal responsibilities of minors who possess knowledge of an impending violent crime. Sonia sought to hold the families of the two boys who knew about the plot accountable through civil action. Her legal team explored the boundaries of negligence and duty of care within the legal system of England and Wales. The endeavour was grueling, intended to establish a precedent that silence in the face of premeditated murder carries consequences. While the criminal courts had dealt with the perpetrator, the civil proceedings highlighted a painful gap in the justice system regarding the passive facilitation of violence. Although the legal thresholds for establishing liability in such cases proved insurmountably high, the effort placed a spotlight on the digital lives of teenagers and the disconnect between online bravado and real-world violence. The case became a reference point in discussions about internet safety and the need for earlier intervention when youths exhibit homicidal ideation. In the years that followed, Sonia channeled her grief into documenting the tragedy to ensure the facts could not be distorted by time or rumors. She authored a book detailing the intricate web of manipulation Davies had spun, serving as both a memorial to her daughter and a warning to other parents about the signs of abusive control in adolescent relationships. The narrative she constructed dismantled the notion that this was a crime of passion, reinforcing the reality of its cold calculation. Her advocacy work focused on educating young people about the dangers of toxic relationships, urging them to take threats seriously, rather than dismissing them as dark humor or banter. The impending possibility of Davies' release remains a source of persistent anxiety for the Aylward family. As the minimum tariff approaches its end, the family is forced to engage with the parole process, submitting victim impact statements to convey the permanent void left by Rebecca's death. The fear that the man who deceived and killed their daughter could return to their community dictates their daily lives. For the wider Welsh community, the woods of Abercynfig remain permanently scarred by the memory of the event, standing as a somber monument to a life stolen for a trivial bet. The legacy of the case serves as a stark reminder of how the trivialization of violence among peers can escalate into irreversible tragedy, leaving the bereaved to navigate a life sentence of their own long after the courtroom doors have closed.